So today I'm recording my 98-hour labor story. I think 98 hours is very, very rare. I know that it's very rare. We were on day 5, so I was watching the sun set and rise several times, still unbelievably in labor. I have my husband here to help me remember the details. It says in the Bible, John, do you have the verse?
Yeah, I got the verse.
It says in the Bible something along the lines of
16:21.
Read it.
A woman, when she is in travail, has sorrow, because her hour is come. But as soon as she is delivered of the child, she remembers no more the anguish for joy that a man is born into the world.
Yeah, and it's so true. After you give birth, it's really hard to remember certain things. I do have a rough outline though, and so this was my first baby. I had been wanting to get pregnant for a very long time, and I'd been with my partner John for about 7 years at this point, and we were trying to have the baby, and I had been preparing for years for the baby. So there was a lot of emotion and anticipation and intensity built up around having this baby. And the pregnancy for this baby was also like horrendous. It was debilitating, and the labor was, appropriately just as bad as the pregnancy. Now, anyone out there who's having their first baby, I don't want you to be afraid. That's the biggest message. That's the biggest thing that I learned. And just to follow up, I have had a second baby since the first, and the second labor was actually a positive experience. It wasn't a quick labor, it was also a long labor, but it was positive. I actually had no epidural the second time, and I gave birth at home, and I'm gonna make a video on that as well. But for my first labor, it was horrific, and it was horrific largely because I did not prepare. I went into this thinking that I'm going to just go to the hospital, and the hospital is full of professionals, and they are going to take care of me and know what to do, and that's a reasonable thing to expect, but that's not how it works. You have to prepare yourself, and I did try to prepare a bit. I went to a centering group, which the hospital recommended. It's where we all do our appointments as a group, and we're supposed to bond, like several couples having children, maybe 10 or 15 women who are all at the same stage of pregnancy. We're supposed to meet every so often in lieu of our doctor's appointments, and that was basically a big waste of time and infringement on privacy. And the bonding thing didn't really happen. It was just like really awkward, and it was not educational. It actually scared me and taught me information that was really not helpful, and actually in a way incorrect. One thing that really harmed my labor and caused it to be so long is that they taught me in that class that there are 3 phases of labor, and that the contractions are going to get more intense, and that they're going to be a certain amount of time apart, and that the time apart is going to get closer and closer, and the intensity is going to increase and increase. And here's the thing, every labor is different, and every professional and everyone who has had more than one child knows that. So they shouldn't be teaching people that, because that was my expectation the whole time. And when you are in labor, it's a very intense experience, like down to your soul level. Like you could die, and your baby could die. You're in a life and death situation that you build anticipation for, and it lasts a long time, and it is painful and scary. Hey, Daniel. You can't be in the video because of YouTube restrictions, so I'm going to avoid putting him in the YouTube video. But anyway, so that's one of the biggest things that I learned, is that the labor took a long time. I think, not just because it was my first labor. Obviously 98 hours of labor doesn't account for it being just because it's my first time, but it was the emotional expectations, their preparation. It was, the expectations were wrong and the preparation wasn't there. So
we didn't do any breathing exercises, believe it or not. They did this meditation thing at the end of each session of that group, but it wasn't that group was terrible. Let's just say that. It was like,
it was a false sense of preparation.
Well, it was like once a week for like several weeks, and I don't know, the information you learned there could have been learned in like a 2-hour class, But anyways, that was too bad because it gave us a false sense of security,
Yep.
But I don't think anything can prepare you quite as much as the real thing,
And this little boy who you hear in the background is Daniel. He was my 98-hour labor baby, my first baby. So I really want to help people. If this is your first labor, you're finding this video, you need to emotionally prepare. That's the biggest thing. And in your emotional preparation, you're going to get educated in other ways as well. Because here's one of the best ways to prepare. If you feel any fear about anything at all, once you get to your having labor, that's going to be magnified because things are going to hurt, and you're going to understand that there's a high risk with giving birth. Not super high, right? But there's some risk there, and it's painful, it gets scary, and so any fears that you might have are going to be magnified. So you need to figure out anything that you're afraid of, go and get educated on it. And for the most part, getting educated, understanding what all your options are, if XYZ happens, whatever fear you might have, understanding your options and knowing what you're going to do in that situation is so important, because when you're in the situation and you're trying to make decisions, that's going to be very stressful for you. What happens when you have stress or any fear is that your body is going to tighten up instead of loosening up. And this is all about relaxing and dilating and feeling oxytocin. Oxytocin is the hormone that is going to be competing against your adrenaline. So you want your oxytocin, the kinds of feelings that you have when you're snuggling and kissing and loving, and that makes you kind of sleepy. That's the hormones that's released once the baby is born. And ideally, you are going to get in a state of mind and do things that release that while you're in labor. And if you have fears and your adrenaline overtakes, then what happens is that you start to lose it. If you get fearful, and that makes your body tighten up, and that makes things a lot more painful. And then because you're in more pain, you're more afraid, and it's a cycle that goes on and on. So you need to make sure that you are able to keep emotional control. And you have to do that by preparing, and you have a good 9 to 10 months to really prepare to avoid getting overly emotional in a negative way.
There are some things that you might think that you should prepare for that you don't know that you should prepare for. For example, when we're at the hospital, the doc, that is not it's not a calm, soothing place. And they're not trying to make you stay calm. The hospital, in our experience, they were actually trying to make it more stressful. It's like they had a deadline to meet. And if we didn't meet that deadline, we were causing them problems. So that's something we were totally unprepared for, and that's really what caused it to go so much longer. Tell them about that. It's so bad.
Yeah, so the hospital, the professionals at the hospital, they told me specifically that this is a very litigious career and situation. And so they are afraid of doing anything wrong. And so they have this book. And they have to follow this book exactly so that they don't get sued. And so even if by experience or common sense, it's obvious that we should do something else or not do a certain thing that the book tells them to do, they will go by the book because they don't want to get sued. Because if anything goes wrong, then you have grounds to sue them. And so I was treated, I don't have their job, and I'm sure their job is very difficult, but I was treated in just a horrendous, inhumane way.
You had a high leak. So because you had a high leak, if you don't have the baby within 24 hours, you're going to get an infection.
Okay, that's not true.
But that's
right. That's what they tell you. They force you to become induced and use Pitocin if you have a leak, meaning that you have a your water has broken, but not like in a gushing sense, but you just have like a small tear in your amniotic sac, then they call it a high leak. And they say that you have a high risk of infection if you don't give birth within 24 hours. And so that's what happened to me. And so then they basically forced me to do the Pitocin, and I didn't want to have any medication. I wanted to do everything naturally because I believe God designed us. There's a really good channel called Built to Birth, or a program called Built to Birth, but the YouTube channel is by someone named Bridget Taylor, and that channel really helped me out. But just the name says it all, Built to Birth, like you're designed to do this. Or if you don't believe in creation or God or whatever, then you can say, okay, millions of years of evolution has prepared us to do this exactly a certain proper way. And when you interfere with that without it being absolutely like life and death necessary, then it creates all kinds of unintended consequences. So, and we're arrogant to think that we know what all those consequences even are. And so you want to avoid doing anything that's unnatural, especially when it comes to birth. So
Pitocin.
I got onto the Pitocin. That's how they induce a labor. They use Pitocin, which is a synthetic form of oxytocin.
Oxytocin. In labor.
Yeah, oxytocin being that love hormone. It also causes contractions. And so I got onto the Pitocin. They kept upping it. And before I got onto the Pitocin, because I knew that Pitocin was supposedly going to make things a lot more painful because it increases the intensity of your contractions, I decided to get that epidural, which I really didn't want to get.
They forced her to get it because they said...
Well, they fearmonger you into doing these things. They create fear because they want you to do everything by this little book they have. And so
if you don't get it now, then we won't be able to give it to you.
Yeah. They say, "Oh, well, if you're in pain and shaking, then we won't be able to give it to you safely," and all this. They also didn't disclose to me this. The epidural punctures your spinal cord, and that doesn't heal ever. So, and because I have scoliosis, they said that they had to triangulate my puncture, meaning they had to do it 3 different times. And they didn't tell me that, so I'm going to have 3 holes in my spinal cord and around the same area, and those don't ever heal. So now I'm afraid that I'm at risk of like my spinal cord being severed if I move too quickly or get a massage that's too rough. And I'm not here to put fear into people's minds or hearts, but if you can avoid getting an epidural, let me tell you this. With my second child, I prepared myself. and I had a home birth, so didn't have an epidural. And
took away that variable of crazy doctors.
it took away the variable of being pressured by people, and I was literally all by myself in this very bedroom that we're in right now, in my own bedroom, for many hours, and this is for my second birth. And I would say my second birth without the epidural was much less painful than my first one. With my first birth, I was given the epidural, and so that took away most of the feeling, but I had what's called a window, and that means that in just one area I still felt it. But that was actually a good thing, because then that meant that I knew when my contractions were going to happen, which meant that I knew when to push. The pushing lasted about 2 hours, and the rest of the labor was 96 hours. So let me get into the story. I started getting the contractions, and the very first 1 or 2 that I got, I was just with my sister. No one else was there. We were at home, and I was on the birthing ball, and those contractions, those first few that I had, were so intense. I got so scared, because I was like, I went back to what they told me at that centering class, and I thought, it's going to get way worse than this? Oh no, I'm not going to be able to handle it. What I know now is that, yeah, just because the first few were intense, those could be the most intense ones. And so I got panicked by those first ones, because I thought that there was going to be this trend that they're going to get more and more intense. And so, again, that class did not set my expectations correctly. It wasn't really true. Everybody's labor is different, and for me, those first few contractions were more intense. But that spooked me, and so I started getting all stiffened up. And basically, over the course of this 4+ days of being in labor, I went to a doctor once or twice outside of the hospital just to confirm whether I was in labor or not, because things are very unsure when it's your first baby. You're like, well, am I in labor? Am I not? Is this Braxton Hicks or whatever? And then, I went in and out of the hospital, I think 3 times. So the first time I went into the triage, because where I'm from, I live close to Seattle. You have to go into the emergency room, and then they take you to triage and decide how much you're dilated. Another thing, throughout this whole situation with my first labor, I had many, many people putting their fingers into me to check my dilation. And if you don't want that to happen, you can actually say no. So I'm really regretful that I felt forced into doing that, because I'm somebody who prefers privacy, and I felt very violated. And you can actually say no, and they made me feel like you can't say no. And with my second baby, once again, I had one midwife with me, one midwife and an assistant, but only one person checked me for dilation. She just checked me one time, and I knew that it was my choice the second time around. And so I just want you to know, if this is your first baby or your second or third or whatever, you don't have to do that. You don't have to let people make you feel violated. And they shouldn't be checking you all the time, because that actually can increase your risk of infection. And who knows, they're touching a lot of people's genitalia and then touching yours, and a lot of things are spread by touch. So for me, I wish that I hadn't felt so afraid that by telling them no, I might be hurting the baby in some way. But I went in the second time being much more educated. Again, you just really have to take things into your own hands as far as being prepared, knowing what to expect, knowing what could go wrong, but having a plan for it so that you're not afraid, and you can face things. And you can accept what things might go wrong. So I got into the triage and they told me that I was 6 centimeters dilated. And great news, because the contractions were pretty intense. But then I was really calming myself and really taking control and, trying to stay cool and calm and collected. And so I was really happy with myself, feeling like, wow, I can do this. I can do this because I'm 6 centimeters dilated and these contractions are pretty mild and I'm calm. Well, then they came in and checked me again after a long time of waiting, because there were a lot of people giving birth at the same time. They came and checked me again and said that I'm only 3 centimeters dilated, which was a huge disappointment. And I said, well, maybe I calmed myself out of it. And the midwife there, who was actually the person who did my centering group, she said, oh no, that's not a thing that happens. You can't go from 6 centimeters back to 3. You don't regress. And maybe that's true, but so they diagnosed me wrong in the triage. And so that really set back my psychology, because I thought, okay, actually, well, these are, mild, but they're not that mild, and I'm only at 3 centimeters. So then I got back to being afraid again. And afraid and frustrated because the drive to and from the hospital was like 45 minutes at that time. And so I was afraid. It was my first time giving birth, and I didn't want to drive away from the hospital in this much pain. Oh my gosh, and fear. And so we left, came back, and then now I have been in labor for, I think, more than 24 hours, and we actually had to leave again because I hadn't made any progress in my dilation. Came back again for the 3rd time, and this time we stayed at the hospital for, I think, a couple of days. Still in labor, my goodness. And they had checked me at one point, and I really was at 5 to 6 centimeters. I stayed at 5 to 6 centimeters until I was almost to 96 hours being in labor. I was still only 6 centimeters dilated after nearly 96 hours of labor. And I had been at that same spot for a very long time, so things just weren't progressing. This is another thing that I feel like this video has become all about bashing the hospital, and that's not what it's intended to do. But this is another thing where you must educate yourself and do not rely on anybody to take care of you or really care about you at all, because through just watching a couple YouTube videos after this ordeal, I learned that, hey, if labor's stalling out, there's a reason, and you need to get up and move around. It's so important. And I would have rather not done the epidural and been able to move around, just so that I wouldn't have to be laying there doing who knows what harm to my body, being in labor for days on end. And I don't think I'm ever going to fully recover from that labor. It really, the epidural punctures alone, never going to heal from that. And got 3 of them. And our modern knowledge, our medical knowledge isn't complete. There's really no saying what damage did happen to me, but I'll tell you that I don't feel 100% ever since then. So it would have been much better to do things the natural way, been able to walk around, because you need to, one thing that I learned is that the head might not be in the right position, or your hips might not be in the right position, but when you move around, it can adjust things and the baby can move into the right position. My body being laying down on a bed or sitting partially inclined or reclined, it was just not going to do the trick, clearly. And I'll tell you what happened. They came into the room, and we had done just about every different intervention that can be done. We had an ICPU bag inserted into me to monitor my contractions. That allows them to see, when I'm contracting, or maybe that's not right. But we had an ICPU bag, which was freaky. It's like a pillow inserted up there, and I didn't want the baby to be touched with like a piece of hard plastic before it's born, or like put anything up into my uterus when I'm trying to give birth. But they told me that that was necessary, and for the baby's safety. And oh boy. So what happened is that I had all these interventions, the Pitocin, the epidural, and they said, okay, the last thing that we're going to do, they said, I'm going to come back and check you in 15 minutes. And if you haven't gone from 6 to 10, then we're going to start talking about doing a C-section. And I did not want to have a C-section because, and I wasn't sure why, because remember, I didn't prepare myself very well because I thought they were just going to take care of me. But I knew that everybody wanted to avoid the C-section and that the recovery was longer. And I even was thinking in my head, well, maybe a C-section would be easier. I've been here for like 4 days. But ultimately, I was able to have the baby naturally because I finally remembered. So I'm a Christian, and I was a pretty new Christian at that time. I didn't go into this with very prayerfully. And I finally remembered, oh yeah, God, let me pray. So my husband and I prayed, and we just prayed that I would finally dilate, that my body would open up, that God would take this situation into his hands and just deliver this baby for us. Like, let it be his hands that deliver this baby. And we prayed, and tearfully and so fervently. And I started like moving, I sat up for this prayer, and I was just I had been trying to like sit up so that gravity might help the baby, just kind of common sense. No hospital professional did that for me, but it's like, okay, common sense. I'm going to take matters into my own hands. Pray. And even though I had been stalled out for several days at 6 centimeters, they, in that 15-minute time period, I had gone from 6 to 10 plus 1. And the plus 1 means that the head is coming out. And so then after 2 hours of pushing, he came out, and the pushing was like, I was just so glad that I got to be to this phase. And I was thinking to myself, this is surreal, that the contractions aren't nearly as bad as I thought they were, because I really believed that they were going to be so bad, and they weren't. And I did have an epidural, but I had that window, so I could feel in one part of my body the intensity of the contractions. And I know with having my second baby, the contractions, you have to like breathe through them, and they are very intense, but not as bad as I imagined. And so I hope I didn't forget anything. John had to take off with the kids because obviously they got too noisy. But thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments or send me a message. And I really, if I put out one message, I would say you must prepare yourself, and don't go into this thinking that the doctors and professionals are all about you and this is going to be a gentle, loving environment. It's going to be about them trying not to get sued, and you're one of 100 different people that they're going to see giving birth today, and just you need to go into it prepared. Like I said, that was my first labor experience, and that was in the hospital, and I was relying on the hospital people to take care of me. With my second baby, I decided to give it all to God, because the first time when I finally gave it to God, everything started going right. So the second time around, I started everything with God, even during the pregnancy. I put everything in God's hands. I had a home birth, so an epidural wasn't even an option. All these interventions weren't even an option. And I didn't even meet my midwife until the day of my labor. I had contacted her and asked her, hey, are you available? Like a month beforehand. But during my second pregnancy, the doctors again were like pressuring me into all these tests and regimens and stuff. And I said, you know what? I don't need that. I don't need that again. God designed me for this. And for those of you out there who don't believe in God, fine. Evolution then. Okay. But your body is designed to give birth. And yeah, things can go wrong. But I'm getting into the second video. I'll make a second video about my second home birth that was all natural, and it was a very positive experience. I would almost go so far to say as it was painless. I didn't even have pain in my second one, and I was singing, and it was just a completely different experience. And to me, I believe it was because I put God in charge of my second one and trusted in him. All right, so subscribe, please, and click like, because I'm trying to grow my YouTube channel. And if you want to see that second video with a positive experience, which I really recommend you watch, yeah, hit subscribe and like. Thanks.